Okay, so this is a Tekin mid-motor RC10 conversion that I'm working on. If you go pretty far back in my video history, maybe about 6 or 7 years, wow, really was that long ago? Probably around that long ago. I did a Tekin mid-motor RC10 build. That was my first Tekin kit that I got. And, I did it kind of traditional, with how everything was laid out, traditional RC10 front end, that used the Tekin suspension arms, used traditional, associated shocks from that era. And, I picked up a few more of these over time, and I figured it would be nice to make a runner. And then I thought about some of the other runners that I have and how I might make this a little bit different so that it's actually like worth running. So for example, at least among my RC10s, I have a normal like RC10 Worlds car, which is, very typical. There's nothing really special about that car. And then I have an RPM Worlds conversion of that kind of car. So you have like this, there's the RPM Worlds tower with the long nose front end. And then you have a chassis narrowing kit to give you longer arms for the same track width. I've run that car a few times at the Vintage Off-Road National. It's a really, really nice car. So if I'm going to, and then as far as like mid-motor cars, my Kyosho Rampage Pro buggy, that is my mid-motor vintage buggy, and it's amazing. So if I'm going to make a mid-motor buggy again, I'd want to make it a little bit different. And lately I haven't been that attracted to doing team associated builds because I feel like I've done a bunch of them in the past, and they're just not that appealing to me anymore. But I figured with this Tekin kit, if I could do some interesting things like put a hydro drive on it and maybe play around with putting different suspension arms on it and doing a different front end, then that could be kind of cool. So obviously this is not anywhere near done yet, but essentially what I want to do here is put in the RPM Worlds front tower, which is like what I have on one of my other RC10s, which in order to mount this, you have to use the RC10T front nose plate, not the RC10 front nose plate. So you got to run that, and that will allow me to run wider arms, because if I remember correctly, the width of the, well, I don't know if width's the right term, but the distance between the hinge pins, the inner hinge pins on this bulkhead is a little bit shorter, I think, than on the RC10 Worlds car, because that's a different front nose plate with these two different mounting points for the suspension arms. So that means you can run longer front arms to get the same track width. And, this front end's just kind of cool looking because it's sort of different, and I don't think anyone's ever put that front end on a Tekin mid-motor conversion. These are pretty rare as they are. And then on the rear, I did a few things. So, obviously you can see here a low-C hydro drive unit. These aren't really necessary at all for running on modern high-grip tracks. If anything, they're a detriment because they're going to, add rotational weight. But I don't know. I kind of like running them, especially even if you're on like a hard-packed dirt track. Sometimes if the track gets a little dusty, the hard-packed dirt tracks that I've raced on, even though they can be very high grip, occasionally if the temperature is just right or just wrong, and if the moisture level of the track is just wrong, I find myself having a really difficult time getting grip. So a hydro drive is actually still rather useful if you use it in the right way, or under the right conditions, rather. And, some people might say, okay, well, for these vintage buggies, you're running a 17.5 motor, so you're just, adding rotational mass to a power-limited class, if you will. And although that's technically true, the thing with the Vintage Off-Road Nationals is that they allow you to run boost. So I can run dynamic timing on my 17.5 motor and essentially recover any loss in power transfer or acceleration, whatever you want to call it, that would result from increased rotational mass. So I'm not too worried about this. And also, it's, you know, it's kind of cool. It's thematically consistent with vintage RC10s. The other thing is you can see I'm running, you know, the Dynatech Klein front and rear arms. Now the thing is with these Tekin kits, Tekin would give you a set of rear arms specific to this kit, because in order to run the active link rear suspension, where essentially you're linking the left arm with the right arm through this special kind of sliding link in the middle here, these pieces here have to mount onto a little ear or sort of extension, if you will, on the Tekin arms for this chassis. So I figured, well, if that's just a hole in a suspension arm, I could take the Klein arms, measure everything out, drill a hole from the bottom, taper it, run a screw up, and, you know, make it work. And sure enough, you know, with enough trial and error, you can actually make this work, and it'll work pretty smoothly. The first, I had to drill, I think, like 2 holes here because I didn't get it quite right the first time. And this whole active link unit is kind of finicky. You know, when you put it together, if you just follow the instructions where it says like you can tighten down certain pieces all the way and this will run freely, that's not entirely true. You do get a little bit of bind, so you have to play a few games with, okay, maybe if I put a washer here or a shim there, maybe that'll free things up a little bit. Same thing with these holes. If these holes aren't drilled in the perfect location, then that's going to cause this side, for example, to distort a little bit, and that distortion is going to cause bind as this unit is sliding in and out. Same thing on this suspension arm here, if it's not in the right location. So then you have to add washers or shims between, you know, this little piece here and this little piece here. So getting that all sorted out, you know, takes a little bit of time, but it is possible. What else was I going to say about this? Also, yeah, there's very little clearance between that active link unit and the stealth gearbox. Very little clearance. So if you want to try to play some games to improve the spacing between this, I'm not sure what you would call it, this center link, this drag link, and the rear bulkhead, so that you have less bind, it's going to run right into the gearbox. So you really have to be very careful with how you tighten all these different screws down so you leave just enough room for everything to move around freely. Okay. Now the other piece that I'm kind of trying to do here is to change how the shocks are mounted. So on this chassis originally, you would get a shock tower like this, and it would mount here. Okay, and this also acts like is kind of a waterfall for the laydown chassis to brace the gearbox against the chassis to keep the chassis from flexing too much. So, you know, what it essentially means is, in terms of the shocks are right here, the rear shocks. So you have a very forward weight distribution for this particular type of mid-motor chassis. On most modern mid-motor chassis, you know, like my Kyosho RB6 or my associated B5 M factory light, or you know, really any modern mid-motor chassis, the rear springs are generally behind the rear suspension arms. Sometimes I think you can play games to put them in front, but typically they're in the back of the chassis. So I figured, okay, nobody that's done these builds has tried to set things up so that they can mount the shocks all the way in the back to make it a bit more like a modern mid-motor buggy. So I figured I would do that. And all you really have to do is, you know, get one of these, in this case, fiberglass RC10 towers. This particular RC10 tower, I think, was for the team car. The World's car had 4 holes here for the shock mounting positions. Okay, but I think the World's car also had less actual material here on the shock tower, and this is key. So you need this shock tower so you have enough material here to drill extra holes in the appropriate place, because these 4 screws have to line up with the little pieces here on the inside, this piece on this side, and there's another one on the other side, and that's what braces this little cross link here in the active link suspension. Okay, so I'm mounting the rear shock tower onto the holes that mount this onto the bulkhead, so everything kind of sandwiches together. So you have to line up, you just measure it out, and then you line up these 2 holes here. And then for these bottom 2 holes, these are actually pretty close to the original 2 holes that are already drilled into the tower. So the way this shock tower mounts conventionally on an RC10, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 holes that go into the rear bulkhead. And so you just got to take these bottom holes and grind them out a little bit toward the inside, and then those screw holes will line up with those little brace pieces for the bottom screw mounting points. So there you go, 4 screw mounting points there. And so then between this position here and let's say the inside of the tower, I can space the shocks out in just the right way to make it fit on the rear of the chassis. Now what's key about this, and the reason why I really wanted to do this, is so that I could fit big bore shocks. With a hydrodrive on here, if you put the rear tower up here as it would normally be, there's almost zero room to fit even a normal shock, like the old school, the old style associated shock. So a big bore shock would not fit here. But behind the hydrodrive, there's a lot more clearance. So if I can mount the shock tower back here and mount the shocks back here, I get more clearance to fit a modern big bore shock. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty much it for now. I'm waiting on a few more pieces to come in before I can continue this build. The rest of it's going to be pretty typical as far as finishing it up. I have a few different ideas for how I might want to fit modern rims on this, because I'd like to be able to run modern rims. So on the rear, for example, I might run Kyosho RB5 rear hub carriers, and then Kyosho CVAs, so I can run, hex rear wheels. And then for the front wheels, there are a few things I can do. I could run, standard like bearing style RC10 front wheels, which is, I've done that enough times on other builds that I don't feel like I want to do it here, because then you have a fixed caster block, and there's not much in the way of adjustability. So, what if I can use something like, let's say, a Traxxas TRX3 caster block, which has at least 2 mounting holes for the roll center on the front of the car. So that would give me some adjustability, and I think those hub carriers also allow you to adjust the spindle height, or the height of the spindle carrier. Okay, so you get a little bit more tuning there. Also, those wheel axles are metric, so I can run. GPM makes these little wheel hexes with a 5x8 bearing on the inside that slots right onto those front wheel axles. So then I can run hex front rims if I want to. So that's one thing I'm thinking of doing for the front. That would be kind of different, because the conventional approach toward converting RC10s to hexes for the front of the car is to run a B4 style front caster block and front steering knuckle, which you could do. But since that's been done, I kind of don't want to do it here. I want to do something different. Yeah, I think that's about it. I'm going to add this steering rack here is just a placeholder. It's a composite craft steering rack. It's perfectly fine, but I saw that A&L or Factory Works, their newer steering racks have a drag link that give you Ackerman adjustment. So I just ordered one of those. I figured that would be nice to have a bit more tunability on this car. And I think that's more or less it. I will actually still have to mount the rear tower on so that I can essentially brace the rear gearbox with these 2 holes against the chassis, so that way this part of the chassis doesn't flex too much. But what that will end up meaning, unfortunately, is that I will have to trim this tower, because I'm not going to be using these shock mounting positions. So I'm going to have to trim that out so that it doesn't, I don't have to trim it out, but it would look really ugly if I had this unused shock tower here and and the actual functional one back here. So, I have a sacrificial tower. I have a few of these, so this one's going to be likely sacrificial for that purpose. Even though I'm actually rather interested to see how this will run. I think one year I will bring it to Vonats if I can get it all together and if I'm happy with how it works. It would just be cool to see This car specifically, also with the Active Link rear suspension. This is what I'm most interested in learning about, because the Active Link effectively gives you dynamic camber gain, so that as the car rolls, the actual contact patch of the rear tires remains constant. It stays flat with respect to the track no matter what the car is doing. So you maintain rear grip throughout the corner, which is really interesting, especially on a mid-motor car where the weight's biased toward the front and the car is going to steer corner really fast. If I can do that and maintain constant rear grip, this thing could be a rocket around the racetrack. So I'm very curious about this. Anyway, yeah, actually, one more thing, sorry. The only thing I'm worried about are these two little ridges here on the bottom of the chassis. You see there's one on the right there, there's one on the left. I think that was done in probably to add some extra bracing to this chassis to keep it from flexing too much, especially at the rear. But the only problem is that I see at a functional level, like if you race this thing and you bottom out a lot, these little ridges here are going to grind into the track and they're going to eat up the track. So, you know, if you have a hard packed dirt track, probably not a problem. But if you run on softer dirt, then that's really going to beat up the track if you don't have a good suspension setup for the rear that keeps it from bottoming out. Yeah, I think that's it. And I'll make another video when I make more progress on this. So thanks for watching.